Dr. Price, I always try to chip away at these questions, and they just get bigger and bigger every time I try to get them knocked out. John Forfar, one of my Patreon members, wrote a message, and he says, "Thanks, Derek. It's a bit out there, I know, but reading the Wikipedia page for Ananias of Adiabene, he sounds a lot like Paul, as suggested by Jacob Berman. Plus, the role of Ananias of Damascus in Acts. I know Dr. Bob thinks Marcion wrote the main part of Galatians, just wondering if it could be shifted in time from earlier rather than later." And of course he says, "Please don't call me sir, it makes me sound old or important or something." But he says, "Cheers, keep up the good work." Thank you so much, John. Dr. Bob?
You know, being called sir and feeling old, my motto is you're only as old as you are. So you might as well not kid yourself. I know this identification from Robert Eisenman and his massive work on James. He says that, for one thing, there were at least 3 Antiochs, because they're all named for Antiochus, one of the generals under Alexander the Great, which is why there are also several Alexandrias, too. And unfortunately, one of them is in the government now. But Adiabene was one of the Antiochs. And, the New Testament mentions an Antioch in Syria and another one in Pisidia. In Acts 14, they go to Pisidian Antioch. I think it's 14, anyway. So which one is it that Galatians is referring to? But when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face. And of course, the issue is he had been eating in company with Gentile converts. And as according to Acts, the Holy Spirit had told him to do, right? Don't call people unclean or the food they're eating. And so he's doing that. Actually, I think the Acts story in chapter 10 is based on a passage in Ezekiel, but nonetheless it implies Peter was associated with that view. So once the emissaries of James the Just from Jerusalem come, and they're stricter, he says, you know, I can get in trouble here. See you later, guys. I'm going to the kosher table. But this doesn't work either. I think in one of my books, I said this is a maneuver right out of I Love Lucy. You know, you're trying to disguise what you're doing and all. Anyway, it doesn't work. It backfires. And Paul sees this and says, what's going on here? You had no trouble having a ham sandwich with these guys. Now you're too good. You're holier than thou. Mm-hmm. And he said, well, you seem to me to be contradicting everything we agreed on, that it's not the Torah that saves, it's Christ. And of course, that isn't just theology. Where does it say in the Old Testament that you're not going to go to heaven if you eat shrimp, right? They're not talking about going to heaven or there even being a heaven, right? So, of course, it's actually true. There's nothing about the Torah saving anybody. But this has come up in the meantime, and Christ is the key. He says, we agree on that, don't we? Then why are you rebuilding this false edifice? And why do you live like a Gentile, like eating the pig picking with the other guys? Why are you suddenly Judaizing the Gentiles? That's the only place in the New Testament where the verb Judaize, Judaizo, appears, but it was well known because it was used to describe Romans, Greeks, whoever, adapting to Jewish ways, not even converting necessarily, but thinking, gee, the Sabbath, that's a pretty good idea, and various other things. So the God-fearers got in on that, right? And so Judaize meant a Gentile adopting some Jewish mores. So that's the only place in the New Testament it comes up. So he's a hypocrite and so forth. And that created a big breach. Well, Eisenman said this rings a bell because we read that in Adia Bene, one of the Antiochs, the prince, Isaetes, I think it was he was much impressed with Judaism, and a wandering merchant, Ananias, was a Jew and converted him. And the guy says, yeah, I think you're right, Ananias. I want to be a part of Judaism. One thing, though, do I have to get circumcised? That might get me in a lot of trouble with the people because they'll think it's just too alien, from not too much of a break from our traditions. And Ananias said, well, yeah, you're right. It doesn't really matter whether you circumcise the flesh. All right. But shortly thereafter, he gets a visit by another Jewish merchant or traveler or whatever, who was kind of an unofficial missionary, Eleazar. And he says, I see you're keeping some of our laws. Maybe you should go ahead and convert to Judaism the whole way. And he says, well, I really did, but I'm just not circumcised. And he says, let's take a look at the Bible. What does God tell Abraham when he makes the covenant with him? He says, you and your generations after you, you got to get circumcised. That seals the covenant. And he says, darn it, if you're not right, okay, I'll do it. And I'll take the risk. And in fact, there wasn't any repercussions from it. But Eisenman said, this sure sounds like what was going on in Antioch and in Paul's churches, according to Galatians, that he goes in there and says, you can worship the God of the Bible and the God of Israel, and you don't have to be circumcised because you're not Jews. You're not coming to it from Judaism. And Jews want to keep circumcising their kids or whatever, let them do it, but you're under no obligation. You don't have to observe the kosher laws. It's like for Jews, it's like they're a fish in water. This is what they've always known. It's no big deal. But you Gentiles, this is weird to you. Circumcision, no pork or seafood. I don't think so. I can still go to synagogue, though, right? Well, yeah. So Paul says you don't have to keep the ethnic markers of the Torah. That's certainly what he means when he says that the law is not for you. He happily quotes the law on ethical issues. That's the old Calvinists. Or anyway, the Protestants were right that Paul is talking about the ceremonial law, not the moral law. He never explicitly says it, but there's no other way to take it. And so Eisenman says that Ananias was Paul, and that Eleazar was one of the men from James. And it wasn't just the same sort of thing, but that this was another telling of the same story. Now, you can't really prove that, but it's mighty tempting. It's very intriguing. And because in Galatians, Paul has told them you don't have to keep the law, and then on his heels, here come Jewish Christian missionaries and says, no, I'm afraid you do have to. Same issue, but that issue probably came up a bunch of times, so who knows. But I doubt Jacob is the first one to come up with this, which doesn't minimize his insight. In fact, I always think of this has happened to me, when I didn't know somebody said so and so, but I thought, I bet this is the way of it. And then later I find out that 100 years ago, Bauer or somebody said the same thing. Do I feel disappointed? No. I feel like, well, what do you know? I'm not crazy. So, all kudos to Jacob. But he's asking if, kind of what Eisenman says, if Galatians is referring to that, because that would be pre-Marcionite. So would you have to choose between saying it's an earlier work, whether by Paul or who knows, or a later one by Marcion? Because I tend to go with the theory that most of Galatians was written by Marcion or Marcionites at least, and who had a whole different outlook on the law and why you didn't need to. And I'd have to admit, it's sort of like 1 Corinthians. Is it awash in Gnosticism because full-blown Gnosticism already existed earlier than we thought in Paul's day, as Walter Schmidtholz thought? Or did the Dutch radicals like Van Manen, were they right by saying, look, the only Gnostics we really know of are found beginning in the 2nd century? It seems to me that the 1 Corinthians really only makes sense in that historical context. Either one of them could be right. There's no definitive way of telling. So it's quite possible.
Yeah. I mean, James Tabor also thinks Paul's resurrection is a spiritual resurrection that he's talking about, not a physical one too, which might play in. He's talking about 1 Corinthians 15, which plays into the whole Gnostic kind of concept of like the Gospel of Thomas. Look around. Yeah, you can't see it, but it's already happened. The repose of the dead, like what the heck?
Yeah, 1 Corinthians is, I think, a patchwork quilt of different Paulinist views competing with each other. People kept adding their view on they couldn't just chop what was there already, but they could try to reinterpret it by putting new material in there. And what you seem to have is a kind of a discussion between Gnostics of different flavors, because they weren't all the same. And in the Nag Hammadi text, you can see one sect arguing with another. So even where he's almost an Encretite, just not quite. They must have had these debates in their own ranks, and the same thing here. There's something he doesn't like about the Gnostic view of resurrection, but when you look at his, it's not that different. Flesh and blood shall not inherit the kingdom of God. That's pretty clear. And
show me that in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
No, this is interesting. It's just.
Oh, by the way, Richard Carrier is great on that. He has some essays in an old collection that Jeff Lauder and I edited for Prometheus called The Empty Tomb, Jesus Beyond the Grave. And he does, and Richard does like this surgical microscope analysis of 1 Corinthians 15, and he's saying this guy is not talking about the same body coming back out of the tomb. The imagery he uses of casting away the shell and all of that, it does imply that the tomb was not empty.
Makes me think of what you do so well, and I think is important, is considering ecclesiastical redactors and people coming right after these letters, whenever they were written. Let's just play that they were written early. I'm going to go with that they were written somewhat early, Paul. Let's just say some form of these letters were written early, and you have like movements that are still moving with these letters.
Yeah.
So to say they didn't try and tweak something to bolster their argument and whatnot is in any of these letters, and I'm not just talking about Paul, that's hard to swallow, to think that's not the case, especially with an existing movement continuing. And Paul arguing in his own day, if we count that this is written early, with other people. So there's stuff going on. Steve Mason, I recently interviewed, he mentions he thinks that Paul encounters, and now he doesn't say Paul himself was Gnostic, but the Apollos figure seems very Gnostic, that Paul encounters. And so is that a pun? Is it like Apollos and Paul? Is that something like, are they same? I mean,
that's been argued.
Interesting. So
it might be that Paul is a short form of Apollos, but I'm not sure if we have evidence to decide that one way or the other. I brought it up at the Jesus seminar once, and nobody seemed to know. So.
Well, he kind of thought maybe this is where the origins of Gnostic teachings Like not their origin, but that you see already in Paul's day, there's someone already teaching stuff like this, and it's competing. So yeah, it's obvious there's Gnostic type stuff, according to Dr. Steve Mason, in Paul's day, and he argues Paul's day early. So if we go with the early day, but yeah, thank you, Dr. Bob.